Okay, now that we've got our lab environment started up, we can now, as you can see, we're logged in. This is what we call the student desktop. In our student desktop, we have a whole set of tools that we'll be using for our lab exercises. The two most common tools that we'll be utilizing, though, are Firefox for our web clients, or our vSphere clients, in fact, and all the other host client and things like that. And then we also have an MPT, or what we call the multi-tab PuTTY utility, that we have already pre-built the ability to SSH into all different systems. But here, let's just take a look at what our lab environment should look like. When you open up Firefox, you'll see we have a set of bookmarks for Site A, which is the vCenter server in Site A, like we showed you earlier. There's a Site A with a vCenter and several hosts that are already there. And then Site B with its vCenter and the single host that's part of that inventory. So let's take a look. You can actually log in to vCenter. There's two separate vCenters, but they are joined in enhanced link mode. So they are, in fact, you just log into one vCenter and you'll see both vCenters. You don't need to create a separate tab for each vCenter. I know in Lab 1 we actually instruct you to do that, but you can actually just log into the one vCenter and you'll see both vCenters. We log into vCenter, of course, as administrator at vSphere.local. Password is VMware1 ! With a capital V, a capital M, WARE, the number 1, and then an exclamation. The ever-present VMware 1 bang, as we always call it. Everything in our lab environment, that's the password, right? Whether it's an administrator or root or whoever, the password is always VMware 1 bang. And you'll note here that here we see our inventories. We see our Site A data center. We see our Site B data center. So we see our completely different vCenter systems all joined together in enhanced link mode. And then in our data centers, we've got in Site A, the two clusters. The compute cluster, which includes vSAN, and a trust authority cluster, which is basically just one host that we're going to use as part of a trust authority exercise later in the class. Our compute clusters contains 3 hosts, several virtual machines, and our Site B data center contains the other cluster that we also will use as part of the trust authority cluster. And we'll also make use of that when we do content libraries. Now, first thing we want to verify, licensing. So open up the administration menu and just verify our licenses are valid. They should be. They're good through the end of 2022. So unless you're taking this on-demand class after the end of 2022, you should be set here, right? We should see there's a vCenter license key, there's a vSAN key, and there's a vSphere key. And they should all have expiration dates at the end of 2022. So this should be valid, right? Unless you have anything else that has expired, you should be fine when it comes to licensing. Now, I know the lab instructions actually have you verify the licenses are valid too. So just there's a step in there. I think it's task 3. You don't need to do that task to actually license anything because the licenses should be valid. These, by the way, are the licenses that are in your vCenter repository. To find out how they've been assigned, click over onto Assets, and then your vCenter servers are showing that they've been assigned this license key. We click on Hosts. We should verify that every single ESXi host has properly been licensed as well, with keys that should expire in 2022. And then our vSAN cluster should also be licensed. So everything should be good when it comes to licenses. Now, the rest of the exercise essentially is going to have you add the 2 ESX servers that are going to be standalone hosts. They won't be part of any cluster. So just in your Site A data center, what we'll do is just add the 2 hosts. The hosts are for Site A, so SA ESXi-01. Password, again, we're logging in as root. Password VMware 1 bang. And then just make sure you add the right license key. Just go ahead and use the same key that's in the vCenter repository. Simple enough. We'll also verify that we add the other ESXi host. Same user, root, VMware 1 bang. And finally, the license key for that be ESXi host. And once we have all these hosts connected, we'll go right ahead and set NTP as well. Now, I know they do this in a slightly different order. They actually have you add the host, set NTP, add the other host, set NTP. But I like it this way. You add the two hosts, and then you can actually just click on the first host, go to the configure, find the time setting here, and we're going to set NTP here. We're going to make sure we enable it. Our time server. Start the service. Make sure it starts with the host. And here's why I like doing this way, because now I've done the first host, just click on the second host and it takes me to the exact same spot on that host. So then go ahead and edit NTP for that host as well. And as long as I got my keys working here. Oop. And so now our hosts are ready to go. Now, just to give you a little bit of a tour of the lab environment, as I was saying, you might find when you first bring up your lab environment, again, it takes some time just to get all the servers powered on, because anytime you disconnect from the lab environment, everything gets shut down. And so you'll need to have them all started back up. If you ever get timed out because of inactivity, again, when you reconnect, you'll have to wait for all the services to start up. It might take a few more minutes once you've actually gotten into the lab environment for vCenter to be up and running as well. How do you verify that vCenter is functioning correctly? Well, what you can do is go to the multi-tab PuTTY utility, open up your vCenter server here, right? So you just double click on each of the different servers you want to connect into. And then a very useful utility is the service-control command. Service-control --status --all will verify the status of all the vCenter services. Not every service is going to be running, but most of them should be running. There's about 5 services that are disabled by default, so they're not actually going to be running. That's normal. But if you find there are more than 5 services that are in the stopped category, then not all the services on your vCenter server have started yet. Sometimes you might find there will be some that are running, and there may be some that are stopped, but there may be some listed here in the middle saying starting pending. Right, so that the startup for that service is actually about to start, but it hasn't started just yet. So just verify that everything that should be running is running and that there are no more than 5 services that are stopped. That's how you know for sure you should be able to log into your vCenter system. If you want to hurry it up along the startup process, one option you do have available is to actually run the start all command. This will find any services that haven't started for whatever reason and attempt to start them. At least the services that are enabled and should have been started already. So you have these different command line tools available for any one of the different servers. Now I added the ESXi host, right? So if I tried to double click to that host, it may not work because we may not have all the different shell services enabled on that host. Right? Host number 2, if I remember correctly, he is actually enabled by default, or at least by our lab team, but host 1 actually doesn't have them enabled. And that's easy enough to fix. You can, of course, do that with the vSphere client, clicking on the host, going over to his services, and then enabling these services. Now, again, these are not recommended to leave enabled, but in training environments, this actually works out pretty well, right? You can set them so that they're running, so if we ever needed to SSH into them, we can go ahead and make sure that they're available. And then, of course, to make sure that that's a permanent setting, we want to make sure that they start and stop with the host. Again, we don't want to do this as a standard practice for production systems, but in a lab environment, this works out pretty well. Now, another thing you might notice when you log into the environment, sometimes you might find that when you first log in, there might be a couple hosts that are showing some interesting error conditions. Maybe that they've been disconnected from the vCenter system. That may just be part of the startup and the normalization of the synchronization between the ESX servers and the vCenter systems. But if you find that a host has been disconnected, one thing you might try is just to quickly see if you can disconnect it and then reconnect it. So that's one of the easiest ways to get a host back in line. Because when you first log into your vSphere inventory, everything should look like this. Everything should be nice, without any errors, without any warnings. If your cluster is telling you that there are the health warnings have been disabled, that's okay. Just reset that to green. It may pop up again later. So there really shouldn't be any error messages. If you can clear some of those messages. If you can't get them to auto clear, usually when it has to do with a host being disconnected, just try to reconnect the hosts. One other set of handy tools are over here under consoles. If you ever needed to enter the console to any of the systems in our lab, we are currently on the student desktop. But if you needed a console to, say, for instance, one of our ESX servers or one of our vCenter servers, you can do that. Just click on the host, for instance. You'll see we'll be consoling into that host. And then you could, for instance, F2 to log into it. Right, so you have access to consoles to each one of the different systems in the lab environment. Other things that we have in our lab environment, which can be kind of helpful. Oh, let's go back to our student desktop. Is the lab manual, which is the other really helpful thing that's in the lab environment. So yeah, you might have your ebook, but over here you do have your lab manual that you can navigate through and just complete the lab exercises without having to open up another document. You've got all the lab's steps all outlined here, which is quite nice. And if you ever needed to copy and paste, right? I know these aren't really copy and paste types of actions, but if there's some command that you would like to copy and paste, right? I can actually do that, right? I can copy, right? But actually what we have over here is send text. We can actually copy whatever we have, paste it in here, and we'll send it right to wherever you have in your console. So you can copy and paste from the lab manual over here if you need to. You can send a Control-Delete to the desktop if you ever needed to. And of course, you also have power controls here. I wouldn't recommend doing any of that. We wouldn't want to have to power off any machines that you were planning on continuing using. So that's one thing I would recommend. Don't power off anything, right? It will power off automatically once you either log out of the lab or if the lab disconnects you due to inactivity. All right, well, that's my quick tour of the lab environment. You guys get to go ahead and do lab number 1, where you're going to do what I just did here. You'll verify your licenses are valid, add your hosts to the inventory, and also set NTP for your hosts. And then in lab 2, you're going to go ahead and create your first distributed switch, the DVS lab distributed switch. So we'll see you when you're done with the labs. We'll see you in the next lesson.